The most dangerous prison is the one everyone applauds you for staying inside. Those words echoed through my mind as I stood beneath the bright lights of the school auditorium, smiling exactly the way everyone expected me to smile. Parents filled every seat, students clapped enthusiastically, and colorful banners celebrating Teacher Appreciation Week stretched across the stage behind me. The principal stood beside the podium with a proud expression as she announced that I had once again been selected as Teacher of the Year. Cameras flashed from every direction while my colleagues rose to their feet in a standing ovation. I accepted the Crystal Award with steady hands, thanked everyone for believing in me, and delivered the carefully practiced speech they had heard from me in different forms for years. I spoke about dedication, kindness, responsibility, and the privilege of helping children discover their potential. Every word was sincere, yet none of it explained the strange emptiness quietly growing inside me. When the applause finally faded, people surrounded me with hugs, congratulations, and invitations to celebrate over dinner. Parents told me they wished their children would grow up to be just like me. Fellow teachers called me an inspiration. Even the superintendent smiled warmly as he shook my hand and thanked me for representing the district so well. I smiled back every single time because that was what Grace Bennett always did. Grace never disappointed anyone. Grace always made the right decision. Grace never raised her voice, never broke expectations, and never questioned the carefully organized life she had spent 31 years building. At least that was the version of me everyone else believed they knew. Later that evening I drove home through the quiet streets of Evanston, as golden sunlight disappeared behind rows of familiar houses. My small white cottage looked exactly as it always had, with neatly trimmed flower beds, a welcoming front porch, and warm lights glowing behind lace curtains. Everything appeared peaceful, organized, and perfectly ordinary. Inside, I placed the new award beside several others displayed neatly on a wooden bookshelf in the living room. They stood in perfect order, reflecting years of achievements that should have filled me with pride. Instead, I found myself staring at them in complete silence. I walked into the kitchen, poured a cup of chamomile tea, and stood by the window watching neighbors laugh together while children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. It was a beautiful evening. Nothing was wrong. Yet something inside me refused to believe this peaceful routine was enough. My phone buzzed with another congratulatory message from my mother reminding me how proud the family was and suggesting we celebrate during Sunday dinner. I smiled softly before typing a grateful reply. She loved telling everyone that her daughter had become the kind of woman every family hoped to raise. Responsible, reliable, respectable. I had spent my entire life protecting that image because making other people proud had always seemed easier than asking myself what I actually wanted. Before going to bed, I opened the window to let the cool spring air drift into the room. Somewhere beyond the quiet neighborhood, thunder rolled softly across the distance, carrying the promise of rain before morning. I did not know that one unexpected storm only a few days later would send me into a small independent bookstore where a single conversation with a stranger would begin unraveling the carefully constructed life everyone admired, including the version of myself I had spent years pretending was enough. The next morning arrived with gentle sunshine spilling through my kitchen window, making everything appear exactly as peaceful as it had the day before. I followed the same routine I had repeated for years without ever questioning it. I watered the flowers on the front porch, prepared oatmeal with fresh blueberries, packed my lunch, and arrived at Jefferson Elementary 20 minutes before the first students walked through the front doors. Every hallway echoed with familiar greetings from teachers and cheerful laughter from children beginning another school day. I smiled at every face, helped a nervous first grader find her classroom, and spent the morning teaching reading lessons that always reminded me why I had chosen this profession in the first place. Watching children discover confidence inside themselves had always brought me genuine joy. Yet even in those moments my thoughts occasionally drifted toward a question I could not answer. Why did a life filled with purpose still feel as though something important was missing? When classes ended that afternoon, dark clouds gathered unexpectedly across the sky. By the time I carried my tote bag toward the parking lot, heavy rain began falling in thick silver sheets, turning sidewalks into shallow streams within minutes. I laughed quietly at my forgotten umbrella before climbing into my car and deciding to wait until the storm became lighter. Instead, the rain only intensified. Since traffic had nearly stopped throughout downtown Evanston, I took a slower route home along quieter neighborhood streets. As I approached a small historic shopping district, I noticed a charming independent bookstore tucked between a bakery and a family-owned florist. Its warm lights glowed softly through rain-covered windows, while a wooden sign above the entrance read Hayes Books and Coffee. I had driven past the shop dozens of times over the years without ever walking inside. Something about the rain and the inviting lights convinced me to pull over and wait for the weather there instead of sitting alone in my car. A small brass bell chimed gently as I stepped through the front door. The comforting scent of coffee, cedar bookshelves, and old paper immediately surrounded me. Soft jazz played quietly through hidden speakers while rain tapped gently against the front windows. Every shelf was carefully arranged with handwritten recommendation cards tucked beneath the books instead of printed advertisements. The entire store felt less like a business and more like someone's favorite room. I wandered slowly between the shelves until I reached a display of contemporary novels. If you are looking for something that changes the way you see the world, I would probably recommend the one on your left instead. The voice was calm, warm, and unexpectedly confident. I turned to find a woman standing a few feet away holding a stack of newly arrived books against her arm. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with shoulder-length dark blonde hair, kind blue eyes, and an easy smile that seemed completely unforced. She wore dark jeans, a soft cream sweater beneath a light brown apron embroidered with the bookstore's logo, and there was an unmistakable sense of quiet confidence about her that immediately caught my attention. "You own this place?" I asked politely. She nodded. "Ido. I am Olivia." I introduced myself, and she smiled as though my name was already somehow familiar. "Grace," she repeated gently. "You look like someone who always chooses books for other people instead of yourself." I blinked in surprise before letting out a small laugh. "Is it really that obvious?" She smiled without answering immediately, then carefully placed one novel into my hands. "Maybe today," she said softly, "you should choose one that surprises you instead." As rain continued falling outside, I looked down at the book resting in my hands, unaware that this ordinary conversation inside a quiet bookstore had already begun changing the direction of my life. For the next several days, I found myself thinking about Hayes Books and Coffee far more often than I wanted to admit. The novel Olivia had recommended rested on my bedside table, and every evening after finishing lesson plans and answering emails from parents, I read one more chapter before going to sleep. It was not simply the story that held my attention. It was the realization that someone I had known for less than 10 minutes had somehow chosen the exact book I needed, without asking a single personal question. By Friday afternoon, I had already finished it. I told myself I was only returning to thank the bookstore owner for an excellent recommendation. That explanation sounded perfectly reasonable until I noticed how carefully I chose my outfit before leaving school. I laughed quietly at myself while changing from my classroom cardigan into a light blue sweater, convincing myself I was simply dressing comfortably after work. The bookstore looked even more inviting beneath the soft golden light of late afternoon. Fresh flowers decorated the front windows, and several people sat inside enjoying coffee while quietly reading. The familiar brass bell chimed again as I stepped through the entrance. Olivia looked up from arranging a display of newly arrived books and smiled with genuine surprise. "You came back sooner than I expected," she said warmly. I held up the novel she had recommended. "I finished it." She tilted her head with an amused expression. "Already? I stayed up much later than I should have." Her smile widened. "Then I suppose the recommendation worked." Instead of immediately suggesting another book, she asked what I liked about the story, what disappointed me, and which character stayed with me after I closed the final page. No one had ever asked me those questions before. Most conversations in my life centered on schedules, responsibilities, or accomplishments. Olivia seemed far more interested in understanding how a story made someone feel. Before I realized it, nearly 40 minutes had passed. Customers came and went while we talked about literature, favorite childhood memories, and the comfort certain places could offer without ever asking for anything in return. At one point she poured 2 cups of fresh coffee and invited me to sit near the front window overlooking the quiet street. Rain had disappeared, replaced by warm spring sunshine reflecting across the sidewalks. "Can I ask you something?" Olivia said gently. I nodded. "Of course." She rested her coffee cup on the small wooden table. When was the last time you did something simply because it made you happy? I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. I thought about teaching, volunteering, family dinners every Sunday, neighborhood events, and the carefully organized routines that filled every hour of every week. They were all meaningful. They were all worthwhile. Yet I struggled to remember the last choice I had made that belonged only to me. Olivia noticed my silence without trying to rescue me from it. She simply smiled with quiet kindness. Sometimes the hardest question has the simplest answer, she said softly. As I prepared to leave, she handed me another novel, this one wrapped in plain brown paper. Do not read the back cover, she said with a playful smile. Trust me. I laughed. You seem very confident. She shrugged lightly. Only because I think you are beginning to trust yourself a little more than you realize. Walking back to my car with the wrapped book tucked beneath my arm, I realized something unusual. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to next week for reasons that had nothing to do with lesson plans, awards, or expectations. I was looking forward to another conversation with someone who somehow made ordinary moments feel quietly extraordinary. The wrapped book sat unopened on my dining room table for nearly an hour after I returned home. I made dinner, answered a few emails from parents, watered the flowers outside my kitchen window, and completed every familiar evening routine before finally allowing myself to untie the simple brown paper ribbon. Inside was a novel I had never heard of, accompanied by a small handwritten note tucked between the first pages. It read, "Some stories remind us who we are. Others quietly ask who we could become. I think this one does both. Enjoy. Olivia." I smiled without realizing it. No grand gesture, no dramatic message, just a thoughtful sentence that somehow stayed with me long after I began reading. The following week settled into its familiar rhythm at school, yet something inside me had begun changing in ways I struggled to explain. During recess, I caught myself noticing how the spring breeze moved through the trees instead of rushing toward my next responsibility. While driving home, I chose quieter streets simply because they were more beautiful. Even my students noticed the difference. One little girl looked up at me after class and said, "Miss Bennett, you smile more now." Her innocent observation caught me completely off guard. That Friday afternoon, I found myself walking back into Hayes Books and Coffee almost automatically, as though the bookstore had quietly become part of my weekly routine. Olivia looked up from arranging fresh flowers beside the front counter, and smiled the moment the small brass bell announced my arrival. "I was wondering whether you liked the surprise," she said. I held up the book with several colorful bookmarks tucked between the pages. I could not put it down. She laughed softly. "That is usually a good sign." The shop was quieter than usual, with only a few customers browsing the shelves while soft acoustic music played gently in the background. Olivia invited me to help unpack a shipment of newly arrived books, insisting she could always use another pair of hands. As we worked together, we talked about everything except our jobs. We discussed favorite childhood memories, places we hope to visit someday, and the simple comfort of rainy afternoons spent reading beside a window. The conversation flowed so naturally that I completely lost track of time. At one point, Olivia pulled a small notebook from behind the counter and handed it to me. Inside were handwritten answers from customers responding to a single question printed across the top of each page. What is one thing you have always wanted to do but never allowed yourself to try? I slowly turned the pages, reading dreams both ordinary and extraordinary. Learn to paint. Travel alone. Open a bakery. Move across the country. Write a novel. Start over. Olivia watched me quietly before asking, "What would you write?" I stared at the blank page she had opened for me. My fingers rested lightly on the pen, but no words appeared. After a long silence, I admitted the truth. "I do not know anymore." She nodded without disappointment. "Then maybe that is where your next chapter begins." As I wrote those words into the notebook instead of a dream, something unexpected settled inside me. For the first time, I accepted that not having all the answers did not mean I was lost. It simply meant I had finally given myself permission to begin asking the questions I had ignored for far too long, and somehow Olivia had become the first person who made that uncertainty feel hopeful instead of frightening. The days that followed felt strangely unfamiliar, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because I had quietly started saying yes to moments I would once have dismissed without a second thought. One Saturday morning, instead of cleaning the house according to the color-coded checklist taped inside my kitchen cabinet, I accepted Olivia's invitation to visit the local farmers market before the bookstore opened. The market stretched across several downtown blocks filled with fresh flowers, handmade pottery, local musicians, and families enjoying the first truly warm weekend of spring. I could not remember the last time I had wandered anywhere without a schedule. Olivia noticed me studying a small table covered with watercolor paintings created by a local artist. "Do you paint?" she asked. I smiled and shook my head. "No. I have never been very artistic." She tilted her head thoughtfully. That was not my question. I looked at her with quiet confusion. She laughed gently. "I asked whether you paint, not whether you are good at it." I realized how often I had avoided experiences simply because I might not perform them perfectly. Before I could overthink the moment, Olivia purchased a small beginner watercolor set from a nearby vendor and handed it to me with a playful smile. "No expectations," she said. "Just curiosity." I protested that she should not have spent money on me, but she simply shrugged. Some gifts are really invitations. We continued walking beneath rows of colorful market tents, while a guitarist played soft folk music nearby. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to move slowly without worrying about the next responsibility waiting at home. Later that afternoon, after helping Olivia organize a community reading event at the bookstore, we carried 2 cups of iced coffee into a quiet park overlooking Lake Michigan. Children chased kites across the open grass while sailboats drifted peacefully across the sparkling water. Olivia opened a sketchbook and began absent-mindedly drawing the shoreline. "You really do try everything," I observed with a smile. She looked up from the page. "Not everything. Only the things that make me feel alive." Her words settled gently into the silence between us. I stared across the lake, wondering when I had last described my own life using those words. Teaching still filled me with purpose, and I loved my students deeply, but somewhere along the way I had confused responsibility with identity. I had become so determined to be dependable that I no longer knew who I was when no one needed anything from me. Olivia seemed to sense my thoughts without asking. "Grace," she said softly, "if nobody expected anything from you tomorrow, how would you spend the day?" Once again, I searched for an answer that refused to appear. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I found myself smiling. "I still do not know." She returned the smile with quiet warmth. "Then we are making progress." As the sun slowly lowered toward the horizon, painting the lake in shades of gold and pale orange, I realized something had shifted inside me. I was no longer visiting the bookstore simply because I enjoyed reading. I was returning because every conversation with Olivia encouraged a version of myself I had never been brave enough to meet. Driving home that evening with the watercolor set resting on the passenger seat beside me, I understood that change rarely arrived like a storm. Sometimes it arrived as a series of gentle invitations, quietly asking whether I was finally ready to stop living the life everyone admired and begin discovering the one that truly belonged to me. Over the next 2 weeks, the changes in my life became impossible for other people to ignore, even though they still felt surprisingly quiet to me. I was not making reckless decisions or abandoning my responsibilities. I still arrived at school before sunrise, prepared every lesson with care, and greeted every student with the same patience they had always known. Yet something about me had softened. I laughed more easily. I lingered outside after dismissal to watch the spring flowers bloom along the school garden instead of rushing straight home. I even began carrying the small sketchbook Olivia had given me, occasionally stopping by Lake Michigan to paint uneven watercolor sunsets that would never win awards, but somehow made me happier than collecting another plaque for perfect performance. One afternoon, while organizing classroom supplies, my closest colleague, Emily, leaned against the doorway with an amused smile. "Can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded while stacking children's storybooks onto a shelf. "Of course." She folded her arms thoughtfully. "Are you dating someone?" I nearly dropped the books in my hands. "Why would you ask that?" Emily laughed softly. "Because you have that look." I frowned with genuine confusion. "What look?" "The one people have when they stop living entirely inside their calendars." I smiled awkwardly and insisted there was no one special in my life. It was technically true. Olivia and I had never spoken about anything beyond friendship. Still, Emily's question lingered with me long after she walked away. That Sunday, I attended my family's usual dinner at my parents' house, something I had done almost every week for years. The familiar dining room smelled of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and apple pie. Family photographs lined every wall, capturing birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, and every milestone my parents proudly preserved. My mother smiled warmly as she placed another serving onto my plate. "You seem different lately," she observed. I looked up cautiously. "Different how?" She exchanged a glance with my father before answering. "Happier maybe, but also distracted." My younger sister smiled teasingly. "She probably finally has a social life." Everyone laughed except me. I simply smiled and changed the subject, unwilling to explain feelings I had not fully understood myself. After dinner, while helping my mother wash dishes, she spoke more quietly. "Sweetheart, I hope you remember that stability is one of the greatest gifts a person can build." I nodded automatically because I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life. Stability, responsibility, reliability. They had become the invisible foundation beneath every decision I made. Driving home beneath the quiet evening sky, I found myself wondering whether stability and happiness were always meant to be the same thing. The following afternoon, I stopped by the bookstore after work. Olivia was arranging chairs for a small community book discussion when she noticed my thoughtful expression. "Long day?" she asked gently. I smiled. "Not exactly. Just a lot of thinking." She pulled 2 mugs of tea from behind the counter and invited me to sit beside the front window. We watched people pass along the sidewalk in comfortable silence before she finally asked, "Do you ever feel like people become uncomfortable when you start changing?" I looked at her with surprise. "How did you know that?" She smiled knowingly. "Because every meaningful change quietly rearranges the expectations other people built around us." Her words settled into my heart with unexpected clarity. For the first time, I realized my greatest challenge might not be discovering who I wanted to become. It might be accepting that not everyone would recognize or understand the woman slowly beginning to emerge. One quiet Saturday afternoon, Olivia closed the bookstore an hour earlier than usual and invited me to take a walk through the nearby botanical gardens. The invitation sounded wonderfully ordinary, yet I found myself looking forward to it all week. We wandered along winding stone paths bordered by blooming tulips, flowering dogwood trees, and carefully tended gardens where butterflies drifted lazily through the warm spring air. Families strolled together, children laughed beside small fountains, and elderly couples sat peacefully on wooden benches enjoying the sunshine. Everything around us felt calm enough to slow the constant stream of thoughts that usually filled my mind. Olivia carried 2 cups of iced tea while I held the small sketchbook that had quietly become part of my everyday life. We stopped beside a quiet pond where white lilies floated across the water, reflecting clouds moving slowly overhead. Olivia sat on the edge of a wooden bench and looked toward the peaceful landscape before speaking. "When I was younger, I believed happiness was something you earned after accomplishing enough," she said softly. "Eventually I realized happiness is something you practice while you are still becoming the person you hope to be." I listened carefully, wondering why every conversation with her somehow answered questions I had never spoken aloud. "What made you realize that?" I asked. She smiled gently. "Losing someone I loved years ago. Not because they died. We simply wanted different lives, and I kept postponing my own happiness while trying to become the person everyone else expected me to be. One day I realized I no longer recognized myself." Her honesty settled quietly between us. I hesitated before asking, "Was it difficult to start over?" She nodded. "Terrifying. But staying would have been even harder." We remained silent for several moments, watching sunlight dance across the pond. For reasons I could not explain, I found myself telling Olivia things I had never shared with anyone outside my family. I admitted how often I worried about disappointing people, how carefully I measured every decision, and how exhausting it sometimes felt trying to become everyone's idea of the perfect daughter, teacher, neighbor, and friend. Olivia never interrupted. She simply listened with complete attention, making me feel understood instead of judged. "Grace," she finally said, "have you ever noticed that everyone who tells you who you should be believes they are helping you?" I nodded slowly. "Yes. That does not mean they are right. Those simple words stayed with me long after we left the gardens. Before saying goodbye outside the bookstore, Olivia handed me a folded flyer announcing a community storytelling night the following weekend. "You should come," she said. I laughed nervously. I am much better at listening than talking. She smiled warmly. Sometimes the stories we are most afraid to tell are the ones we most need to hear ourselves. Driving home beneath the fading evening light, I realized I no longer looked forward to seeing Olivia simply because our conversations were interesting. I looked forward to them because every hour spent beside her felt strangely honest. She never tried to convince me to change, yet I found myself changing anyway. As I unlocked my front door that evening, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and noticed something I had not seen in years. The woman looking back at me appeared lighter, calmer, and somehow more alive than the version of Grace Bennett who had accepted another award only a few weeks earlier. For the first time, I wondered whether the life I had always called safe had actually been keeping the truest version of myself waiting just beyond a door I had finally begun to open. The community storytelling evening arrived on a warm Friday night, just as the last traces of sunlight disappeared beyond the rooftops of downtown Evanston. Hayes books and coffee looked different than usual. The bookshelves had been gently rearranged to create a cozy gathering space filled with folding chairs, soft lamps, and small tables decorated with fresh wildflowers. The comforting aroma of coffee blended with the familiar scent of old books while quiet conversations filled the room. People of every age settled into their seats, ready to share memories, dreams, and pieces of themselves with complete strangers. I almost turned around before opening the front door. Public speaking had never frightened me inside a classroom, but speaking about myself felt entirely different. Olivia noticed me standing hesitantly near the entrance and walked over with her familiar reassuring smile. "You came," she said warmly. I nodded. "I almost did not." She laughed softly. "Most meaningful decisions begin with that sentence." She handed me a cup of hot tea before leading me toward two empty chairs near the back of the room. Throughout the evening, one person after another stepped forward to tell deeply personal stories. A retired firefighter described learning to slow down after decades of rushing toward emergencies. A young musician spoke about leaving law school to follow a lifelong dream. An elderly woman shared the story of meeting her wife more than 40 years earlier, and how ordinary moments had become the greatest treasures of their lives. The room listened with complete respect, applauding every speaker not because their stories were perfect, but because they were honest. I found myself watching Olivia as much as the storytellers. She smiled at every speaker with quiet encouragement, creating a space where vulnerability felt safe instead of frightening. Near the end of the evening, she gently turned toward me. "Would you like to share something?" she asked. I immediately shook my head. "Not tonight." She accepted my answer without disappointment. "Then simply listen." Walking home afterward beneath a sky filled with stars, I realized I had been unusually quiet all evening. Olivia noticed before we reached my car. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. I hesitated before answering. "I think I finally understand why I keep coming back here." She tilted her head with gentle curiosity. "Why?" I looked at the softly glowing bookstore behind us before speaking. "Because this is the first place where I never feel like I have to earn the right to belong." Her expression softened in a way I had never seen before. "Grace," she said quietly, "you have always belonged. You simply spent too many years believing you needed permission." My heart seemed to pause for a single impossible moment. We stood there in comfortable silence while a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming lilacs through the quiet street. I looked into her blue eyes and suddenly understood the truth that had been quietly growing inside me for weeks. The happiness I felt whenever she smiled, the calm that settled over me during our conversations, the disappointment I experienced whenever we said goodbye, none of it was ordinary friendship anymore. The realization did not frighten me because of who Olivia was. It frightened me because it asked me to question everything I had believed about the future I had carefully planned. As I drove home that night, I did not turn on the radio. I simply listened to the quiet sound of the road beneath my tires while one undeniable thought echoed gently through my mind. Somewhere between the pages of borrowed books, peaceful walks beside the lake, and countless honest conversations, I had fallen in love with the woman who never once asked me to become anyone other than myself, and I had no idea what that truth would ask of me next. The days following the storytelling evening became the most confusing of my life. Nothing had changed on the outside. I still greeted my students each morning with the same warm smile, corrected spelling quizzes during lunch, and attended faculty meetings where everyone discussed lesson plans and upcoming school events. Yet inside me, every familiar routine felt different because I now carried a truth I could no longer ignore. I loved Olivia. Simply admitting those words to myself felt overwhelming. I had always believed my future followed a clear path, carefully shaped by responsibility, family expectations, and the quiet certainty that life rewarded people who stayed within familiar boundaries. Loving Olivia did not feel wrong. It felt honest. What frightened me was wondering whether honesty would cost me everything else. That Sunday, I arrived at my parents' house for our usual family dinner, hoping the familiar comfort of routine might quiet the questions filling my mind. Instead, the evening seemed to magnify them. My mother excitedly described a retirement celebration being planned for one of her closest friends before turning toward me with a thoughtful smile. "Grace, everyone keeps asking when you are finally going to start thinking about your own future outside of work." My father nodded in quiet agreement, while my younger sister teased me gently about spending too much time surrounded by books instead of people. Their comments were made with kindness, yet every word reminded me how carefully my life had always been defined by expectations I never questioned. I smiled politely, changed the conversation, and finished dinner feeling more exhausted than hungry. Driving home beneath the fading orange sky, I realized I had not answered a single question honestly all evening. The following afternoon, I stood outside Hayes Books and Coffee with my hand resting on the front door handle. Through the window I could see Olivia helping a young customer choose a novel, smiling with the same warmth that had slowly changed my life. My heart wanted nothing more than to walk inside. Instead, fear quietly whispered that everything beautiful between us might disappear the moment I acknowledged what I truly felt. I stepped back from the entrance before the small brass bell could announce my arrival. I returned to my car without opening the door. The next day Olivia sent a short message asking whether everything was all right because she had not seen me in several days. I stared at the screen for nearly 10 minutes before replying that school had become unusually busy, and I needed some time to focus on work. The explanation sounded believable enough, but even as I pressed send, I knew it was only half the truth. The real reason was far more difficult to admit. I was afraid that if I continued seeing her, the life I had always known would never fit me again. Over the next week, I deliberately filled every afternoon with extra responsibilities at school. I volunteered for additional committee meetings, reorganized classroom materials that did not need organizing, and stayed long after other teachers had gone home. Every empty hour became another opportunity to avoid the place where I most wanted to be. Yet no matter how carefully I planned my days, I found myself looking toward the quiet street where the bookstore stood each time I drove through town. One rainy evening, I noticed the warm lights glowing behind its windows from across the intersection. For several long moments, I simply sat at the traffic light watching people step inside, laughing as they escaped the rain. The light turned green, but I remained still until another driver gently sounded the horn behind me. As I slowly drove away, I realized something painful. I was not protecting myself by staying away from Olivia. I was protecting the version of Grace Bennett that everyone else expected me to remain, even if it meant quietly walking away from the first person who had ever made me feel completely seen. The following Monday morning felt unusually quiet, even though the school hallways buzzed with the same cheerful energy they always had. My students laughed as they hurried into the classroom, proudly showing me drawings they had completed over the weekend, and I smiled back with genuine affection. Teaching still filled my heart with purpose, yet every joyful moment seemed accompanied by the lingering absence of someone I had chosen not to see. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since I last stepped inside Hayes Books and Coffee. I had convinced myself that distance would make everything simpler. Instead, it had only made every ordinary day feel noticeably smaller. During lunch, Emily sat beside me in the faculty lounge and watched me absent-mindedly stir my soup without taking a single bite. "Grace," she said gently, "you have looked lonely ever since you decided to become busy." I laughed softly at the unexpected wording. Busy and lonely are not the same thing. She smiled kindly. Sometimes they are exactly the same thing. Her words followed me through the rest of the afternoon. After school ended, I found myself driving toward home before instinctively taking the familiar turn that led downtown. I did not consciously make the decision. My hands simply guided the car along streets that had become meaningful for reasons I had spent days trying to ignore. When I reached the bookstore, the lights inside were still glowing warmly, but something immediately felt different. A small sign in the front window announced that the shop would be closed the following week for several days. My heart tightened with quiet uncertainty. I finally gathered enough courage to step inside. The familiar brass bell rang above the door, but Olivia was nowhere in sight. Instead, an older woman arranging books behind the counter greeted me with a warm smile. "You must be Grace," she said. I looked at her with surprise. "You know my name?" She nodded gently. "Olivia mentioned you many times." Before I could respond, she reached beneath the counter and carefully placed a cream-colored envelope in front of me. My name was written across the front in Olivia's familiar handwriting. "She asked me to give you this if you ever came back," the woman explained softly. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter folded around a simple pressed wildflower. I quietly began reading. "Dear Grace, if you are holding this letter, it means you found your way back, and I am grateful for that, even if it took longer than either of us expected. I noticed your silence long before your messages became shorter. I never wanted you to feel pressured to explain feelings before you were ready. Sometimes people need space to hear their own hearts without someone else's voice becoming louder than their own. I have accepted an invitation to spend several weeks helping my aunt reorganize her small bookstore in Boston. I planned the trip months ago, and perhaps the timing is simply life reminding us that change never waits until we feel prepared. Please do not come looking for me because you think you owe me an answer. Only come if one day your answer belongs completely to you. Whatever you decide, meeting you has already changed my life for the better. Thank you for reminding me that kindness still has the power to transform ordinary days." I lowered the letter slowly, unable to speak. The older woman offered me a gentle, understanding smile before quietly returning to her work. As I walked back outside, the evening breeze carried the scent of blooming lilacs through the nearly empty street. For the first time since I had walked away from the bookstore, I understood that Olivia had never asked me to choose between her and the expectations surrounding my life. She had only asked me to choose honestly, and standing alone beneath the fading spring sky, I realized I no longer knew whether I was more afraid of losing the life everyone admired or losing the woman who had quietly taught me how to become myself. That night I read Olivia's letter so many times the folded edges began to soften beneath my fingertips. Every sentence carried the same quiet kindness she had always shown me, never demanding an answer, never asking me to become someone different, only reminding me that the most important choices could never be made to satisfy someone else. I sat beside the open window of my living room while the cool evening breeze drifted through the curtains, listening to the gentle sounds of the neighborhood settling into another peaceful night. For the first time in years, I stopped asking myself what everyone else expected from me, and asked a different question instead. If no one were watching, what kind of life would I choose? The answer arrived with surprising clarity. I would choose the life where I felt most like myself, and somehow every memory leading to that answer included Olivia. The following morning, I arrived at school carrying a calmness that felt unfamiliar but genuine. During reading time, one of my students struggled to pronounce a difficult sentence before looking up at me with uncertain eyes. I smiled encouragingly and said the same words I had repeated to countless children over the years. You do not have to be perfect to move forward. You only have to be brave enough to try. The moment the words left my mouth, I realized I had spent my entire adult life teaching lessons I had never allowed myself to believe. After classes ended, I remained alone in my classroom watching the late afternoon sunlight stretch across rows of empty desks. Emily quietly stepped inside carrying her bag over one shoulder. "You look different today," she observed. I smiled softly. "I finally understand something." She waited patiently. "What is it?" I looked around the classroom that had shaped so much of my life before answering. I have spent years trying to become the person everyone admired. I forgot to ask whether she was the person I wanted to be. Emily's expression softened with quiet understanding. "That sounds like an important discovery." I nodded. "It is." Driving home that evening, I did not stop at my house. Instead, I continued toward the lake where Olivia and I had shared countless conversations. The shoreline was peaceful beneath the fading sunlight, with gentle waves rolling toward the sand while families packed away picnic blankets and children chased seagulls along the water. I sat on the same bench where Olivia had once asked me how I would spend a day if no one expected anything from me. Back then I had no answer. Now I finally did. I would spend it honestly. I would spend it loving the people who made me feel alive instead of pretending I needed nothing beyond routine. I reached into my bag, unfolded Olivia's letter one more time, and smiled through unexpected tears of gratitude rather than sadness. She had never tried to rescue me from my fears because she understood something I was only beginning to learn. Real change could never be borrowed from another person. It had to grow from a choice made freely. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond Lake Michigan, I took out my phone, searched for the train schedule to Boston, and quietly realized I was no longer running toward someone else. For the very first time in my life, I was finally running toward myself, and I hoped with all my heart that our paths would meet again before the next chapter of both our lives had already begun. The next morning began with a quiet certainty I had never experienced before. Instead of questioning every decision, I simply started making them. I requested 2 personal days away from school, something I had never done without months of advanced planning. My principal looked surprised but immediately approved the request, reminding me that everyone deserved time to care for themselves. As I walked back to my classroom, I realized how often I had assumed asking for something meant disappointing someone else. That afternoon I packed a small overnight bag with only the essentials, placed Olivia's letter carefully inside the front pocket, and left my perfectly organized house exactly as it was. For the first time in years, I chose not to create a detailed schedule. I simply trusted that I would find my way. The train station buzzed with travelers carrying suitcases, coffee cups, and hopeful expressions. I purchased a ticket to Boston, found a quiet window seat, and watched familiar streets slowly disappear behind me as the train gathered speed. The rhythmic sound of the rails beneath us felt strangely comforting, almost as though every passing mile carried away another layer of fear I had been holding for far too long. During the journey I thought about the woman I had been only a few months earlier. She had measured success through approval, certainty, and carefully followed expectations. Now I understood that growth rarely arrived through certainty. It arrived through courage, honesty, and the willingness to keep moving even without knowing exactly how the story would end. Late that afternoon, the train finally rolled into Boston beneath a sky filled with soft gray clouds. After checking into a small hotel near the historic district, I unfolded Olivia's letter once more and looked at the bookstore address her aunt owned, grateful that she had casually mentioned it during one of our conversations months earlier. The next morning I walked through streets lined with brick buildings, small cafes, and independent shops until I found a charming bookstore with flower boxes beneath its front windows. My heart raced as I stood across the street, suddenly overwhelmed by the possibility that I might be too late or that my arrival might change nothing at all. Before I could lose my nerve, I crossed the street and stepped inside. The familiar scent of books and fresh coffee immediately reminded me of home. A woman arranging new arrivals smiled politely and asked whether she could help me find something. I took a slow breath before answering. "I am looking for Olivia Hayes." The woman smiled knowingly. "She is upstairs helping organize our inventory. Would you like me to tell her someone is here?" I shook my head gently. "If it is all right, I would rather surprise her." The woman pointed toward a narrow wooden staircase at the back of the store. Every step upward seemed louder than the one before. At the top of the stairs I saw Olivia standing beside a tall bookshelf, carefully placing novels onto freshly painted shelves while afternoon sunlight streamed through large windows behind her. She had not noticed me yet. For a brief moment I simply stood there, grateful that life had given me one more chance to reach this place. Then she turned, our eyes met across the quiet room, and surprise slowly gave way to the warm, familiar smile I had carried with me through every mile of the journey. Without speaking a single word, I understood that the hardest part had never been traveling to Boston. The hardest part had been finding the courage to become the woman who was finally ready to walk through the door instead of turning away from it. Olivia remained completely still for a moment, as though she needed time to believe I was truly standing there instead of imagining me. Then she laughed softly, the familiar warmth in her eyes returning exactly as I remembered it. "Grace, she whispered, almost as if saying my name aloud might make the moment disappear. I smiled through tears that no longer came from fear. I finally found my answer. She walked toward me slowly, giving me every opportunity to change my mind if I wanted to. I did not move. I had spent too much of my life stepping backward whenever something mattered. This time I stood exactly where I wanted to be. When she reached me, we simply looked at each other for several quiet seconds, surrounded by shelves filled with stories that had helped bring us to this one. I thought you needed time, Olivia said gently. I did, I replied. But I also realized that time only matters if you use it honestly. She smiled, her expression filled with both relief and quiet understanding. And what did honesty tell you? I took a slow breath before answering. It told me that I was never afraid of loving you. I was afraid of becoming someone my life had never prepared me to be. Then I realized that every meaningful part of my life began the moment I stopped pretending I already knew who I was. Olivia's eyes glistened as she listened without interrupting. I spent years trying to become the woman everyone admired, I continued. But I never asked whether she was the woman I wanted to become. You never asked me to change. You only gave me the space to meet myself. That changed everything. She reached for my hand with quiet tenderness, waiting until I gently held hers before speaking. Grace, I never needed you to choose me over anyone else. I only hoped one day you would choose yourself. I smiled because I finally understood the difference. We left the upstairs office together and walked through the bookstore before stepping outside into the bright afternoon sunshine. Boston bustled around us with conversations, distant laughter, and the comforting rhythm of an ordinary day continuing as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet everything had changed for me. We wandered through the nearby streets without rushing anywhere, talking about the weeks we had spent apart, the lessons we had each learned, and the future neither of us wanted to plan too tightly anymore. For once, uncertainty no longer frightened me. Felt like possibility. Before sunset, we reached a small park overlooking the harbor where boats drifted peacefully across the water. We sat quietly on a wooden bench while a cool breeze carried the scent of salt air across the shoreline. I leaned back, watching sunlight shimmer across gentle waves, and realized I felt lighter than I ever had before. My career still mattered. My family still mattered. My values had not disappeared. What had changed was the understanding that my own heart deserved a place among them instead of always standing last in line. Olivia looked toward the horizon before turning to me with the same calm smile that had welcomed me into a quiet bookstore months earlier. I smiled back and softly said, "For the first time in my life, I chose my own story." She squeezed my hand and together we watched the sun slowly disappear beyond the water, knowing our future would still contain questions, challenges, and unexpected turns, but also knowing we would meet them honestly, side by side. Looking back now, people might say the good girl disappeared somewhere along the way. They would be mistaken. She was never lost. She simply stopped living inside everyone else's expectations, and finally discovered that the greatest act of courage was not becoming someone new, but allowing the truest version of herself to step into the light at last.